Firehole Bench, Wyoming, September 1878. The air was already sharp with the coming cold, a clean, high-altitude promise of the brutality to follow. Most men were chinking walls, stacking wood, or banking their cabins with earth. Einar Magnusson was digging a ditch, not a foundation trench, not an irrigation channel, but a long, straight gash in the earth, 40 feet from the door of his modest cabin to the steaming vent of a small, hot spring he'd claimed. Webb Calloway, the territorial road surveyor, stopped his horse, leaning on the pommel of his saddle. He was a man who understood angles, gradients, and the unforgiving logic of water. He watched the Icelander heave another shovelful of dark, root-laced soil onto the growing mound beside the trench. "Magnusson," Calloway called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man paid to be right. "What in God's name are you building? A private canal to hell?" A few other settlers, Silas Croft and Abel Tucker among them, had gathered nearby, their curiosity piqued by the strange, months-long project. Einar straightened his back, wiping a sleeve across his forehead. He was not a large man, but his movements were economical, born of a lifetime of labor. He nodded a greeting. "A passage," he said, his English precise, but accented. Calloway scoffed, a dry rasping sound. "A passage for what? The spring runoff? 40 feet of hand-dug tunnel is a drowning ditch, man. First real snowmelt comes April. It'll fill that trench, rot both your sill plates, and the whole claim, cabin, bathhouse, and whatever foolishness you're burying, sinks into the bench. I've surveyed enough washouts to know." Silas Croft, a farmer whose hands were permanently curled from gripping plow handles, shook his head. "It's madness. All that work for a covered walkway." "He's a strange one, that Icelander," muttered Tucker, "always doing things backward." Einar looked at the trench, then back at Calloway. He offered no defense, no argument. He simply said, "The water will have a place to go." Then he bent, drove his shovel back into the soil, and continued his work. The men watched for another minute, seeing nothing but a fool digging his own grave, and rode on, their laughter hanging in the crisp autumn air. The mockery was a constant low hum on the bench, but Einar paid it no mind. He had felt a cold Calloway couldn't survey, a cold that lived inside the walls and in the very iron of the hinges. He was not digging a ditch, he was burying the winter. What did this Icelandic stofa builder, a man from a treeless island of volcanoes and turf, understand about the physics of cold bridge elimination that a professional surveyor and a lifetime of frontier experience had missed? The answer to that question would rewrite the rules of survival on the Firehole Bench. It would be written not in words, but in degrees of temperature, in cords of wood not burned, and in the quiet, undeniable proof of a single wet rag that refused to freeze in the heart of a Yellowstone winter. If you stick with me through this story, I promise you will learn a fundamental principle of thermal dynamics that modern architects are only now rediscovering. It's a lesson in how the simplest solutions, drawn from ancient wisdom, can defeat the most brutal forces of nature. Before we go on, if you enjoy stories of practical genius and hard-won vindication, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support allows us to keep digging up these incredible histories. And let me know in the comments, what's the most clever cold weather solution you've ever seen? Einar Magnusson was not a carpenter, not a logger, and certainly not a frontiersman in the American mold. He was a man whose hands understood the language of sod, stone, and the deep, abiding warmth of the earth itself. He had been raised on a farmstead near Skagafjörður in Iceland, a place where timber was more precious than gold. His family's home was not a single building, but a connected series of chambers, the skáli for sleeping, the eldahús for cooking, the badstofa for living and working, all linked by covered, turf-walled passages. One could live for months, through howling blizzards and horizontal snow without ever setting foot in the open air. His trade was the art of the stofa, the heated living room. But more than that, it was the science of connection, of making a single, warm organism out of disparate parts. When he arrived in Wyoming with his wife Solveig and their two small children, Bjorn and Freya, the abundance of timber felt like a miracle. He built a cabin just as his neighbors had, a solid log structure with a stone fireplace and a shake roof. He followed the local wisdom. He thought the thick logs would be enough. The first winter, in 1877, taught him how wrong he was. That winter was a lesson in the physics of misery. Einar had never known such a dry, invasive cold. In Iceland, the cold was damp and moderated by the sea. Here, it was a crystalline predator. The tallow in their candles, left on the table overnight, turned to a hard, white putty that wouldn't light until it was warmed by the fire for an hour. When Solveig opened the cabin door in the morning, the iron hinges didn't creak. They rang with a sharp, metallic clang, like a hammer striking an anvil, the frost inside the metal making it brittle. Most unsettling of all was the breath crust. Every nailhead that pierced the roof rafters from the outside conducted the cold straight through the wood. In the mornings, each nail was adorned with a delicate, feathery rime of frozen breath, a constellation of tiny white stars on their ceiling marking every point of thermal failure. They burned through their entire woodpile by February, and Einar spent the last 2 months of winter hauling deadfall from the woods, a desperate daily struggle just to keep the cold at bay. The children were always bundled, their faces chapped, their coughs a constant worrying rhythm in the small, smoky cabin. Einar knew he had built not a shelter, but a sieve for heat. The problem wasn't the logs. The problem was the air. The American frontier cabin was designed as a fortress, a single box, fighting a lonely war against the outside. But the greatest heat loss wasn't through the walls. It was through the necessary acts of living. Every trip to the woodpile, every visit to the outhouse, every bucket of water fetched from the creek was a thermal catastrophe. The door would swing open, and a solid wedge of sub-zero air would pour into the cabin, displacing the precious warmth, which would rush out into the void. The fire would roar to compensate, devouring wood, only to have its work undone 30 minutes later. His neighbors suffered the same fate, only they accepted it as the price of admission. They built bigger fires. They wore more layers indoors. They lived in a state of constant, exhausting battle. Webb Calloway's own well-built cabin, a model of tight joinery, still had a fine layer of ice on the floor near the door all winter. Silas Croft's family sealed one of their windows with canvas and mud every November, plunging half their home into darkness just to reduce the drafts. The conventional wisdom treated the cabin and the outside world as two separate entities, with the door as the border. But that border was crossed 100 times a day, and every crossing was a defeat. Einar saw the flaw not in the walls of the fortress, but in the space between the buildings. The true enemy was the journey. So, in the late summer of 1878, he began his work. He was not merely building a tunnel, he was applying an ancient principle to a new world. The project began with the bathhouse itself, a small, sturdy structure built directly over the hot spring vent. He dug its foundation deep, sinking the floor 2 feet below ground level. Then, he began the trench, 40 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. It was brutal work. The bench soil was rocky and dense. Calloway's mockery was rooted in a real concern. A simple trench would indeed become a river of mud and ice. But Einar's design was more complex. At the bottom of the trench, he laid a simple but effective drain, a continuous line of fist-sized rocks, creating a channel for water to flow from the cabin's foundation downhill, past the bathhouse, and away from the structures. He wasn't ignoring the water. He was giving it a path of least resistance, a path that was not inside his passage. Over this rock drain he laid down thick, hand-hewn planks as a floor. Then came the walls. He drove stout pine posts every 4 feet along the trench, then lined the earthen walls with more rough-sawn lumber, creating a clean, timbered passage. The roof was the critical element. He laid thick pine beams across the top, leaving them just below ground level. On top of these, he layered the sod he had so carefully excavated. He laid the first layer grass down, the second layer grass up, just as his father had taught him. The dense, root-matted turf of the Wyoming bench was a phenomenal insulator, far superior to the thin sod of his homeland. When he was finished, the land was nearly seamless. A long, low mound, barely 2 feet high, was the only evidence of the massive structure lying beneath. At both ends where the tunnel met the cabin and the bathhouse, he banked the earth high against the walls, creating a thick berm that sealed the connection. Solveig watched him from the cabin door, her arms crossed. "It looks like a burial mound, Einar," she'd said one evening, a small smile playing on her lips. "The neighbors will think we are burying giants." "We are," he replied, not looking up from his work of fitting a small, vented door at the cabin entrance to the tunnel. "We are burying a giant named Winter." Calloway rode by again in October, just as Einar was finishing. The surveyor dismounted, walking the length of the low mound. He kicked at it with his boot. "You've put a lot of work into your own ruin, Magnusson," he said, not with malice, but with the weary certainty of an expert. "That sod roof will get heavy with meltwater and collapse. I give it till May. You're lucky it's underground, so the fall won't kill you." "The sod will hold," Einar said. "And the air in there? It'll be a stagnant, frozen tomb, colder than the outside by 10 degrees once the ground freezes solid around it. You've built yourself a 40-foot icebox." "The ground does not freeze so deep," Einar stated calmly. He had finished. He had built his passage. Now all he had to do was wait for the winter to come and prove him right or foolish. The genius of Einar's design was not in what it added, but in what it eliminated. Webb Calloway and the other settlers understood heat in simple terms. You produce it with fire. They understood insulation. You build thick walls to slow its escape. What they failed to grasp was the concept of a cold bridge, the pathway through which heat is aggressively stolen from a structure. For them, the biggest cold bridge was a drafty window or a poorly chinked log. For Einar, the cold bridge was the 40 feet of open, sub-zero air that separated a man from his destination. The physics are elegantly simple. The temperature of the earth a few feet below the surface is remarkably stable. On the firehole bench, it hovered around 38 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. It was a vast thermal battery. While the air temperature outside could swing from 80 degrees in summer to 40 below in winter, the ground remained a constant, inexhaustible reservoir of not freezing temperature. Einar's tunnel did not connect his cabin to the outside world. It connected his cabin to the earth. The thick sod roof, packed with 6 inches of soil and a dense mat of roots, acted as a powerful insulator against the air above. The earthen walls of the tunnel were constantly, passively radiating that gentle 38-degree warmth into the passage. The tunnel didn't need a stove. It was being warmed by the entire planet. Calloway's prediction of a frozen tomb was based on his experience with cellars and outbuildings, which are often poorly sealed from the surface air. Cold air, being dense, would pour into any unsealed underground space and settle there, chilling the surrounding earth and creating a permanent pocket of frigid air. Einar had prevented this. His well-sealed doors at either end and the thick earth berms meant that the air inside the tunnel was trapped. It was still air, and still air is a fantastic insulator. The result was a thermal buffer zone. To go from the 70-degree cabin to the 90-degree bathhouse, heated by the steam vent, one did not pass through minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit air. One passed through a pocket of 38 degrees Fahrenheit air. The thermal shock was eliminated. When Einar opened the interior door to the tunnel, he wasn't inviting a catastrophic invasion of Arctic air into his home. He was opening a door to a cool, but not freezing hallway. The heat loss from his cabin into the tunnel was trivial compared to the heat loss that would have occurred by opening his main door to the outside. He had effectively extended the thermal envelope of his home by 40 feet. He didn't heat 2 rooms against the winter. He had created a small, stable ecosystem in between them, moderated by the immense thermal mass of the Earth itself. That winter, the Yellowstone Basin inversion arrived. It was not a blizzard, not a storm of howling winds. It was a quiet, suffocating cold. For 14 consecutive nights, the temperature on the bench plunged to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, with daytime highs barely struggling to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. A thick, icy fog settled in the valley, locking the cold to the floor of the world. There was no wind. The cold didn't bite. It crushed. Smoke from chimneys rose 10 feet and flattened out, unable to pierce the heavy ceiling of frigid air. In the other cabins, life ground to a halt. The world shrank to the few feet around the stove. Wood piles vanished at an alarming rate. The Croft family moved their beds into the main room, huddling together around their hearth, their breath pluming in the corners of the room. Abel Tucker's youngest son was sick with a lung-rattling cough, and the constant exposure to drafts from the door as his father fetched wood and water made it worse. The simple act of stepping outside was a physical assault. Exposed skin would ache in seconds, and the air felt like shards of glass in the lungs. In the Magnusson cabin, a different reality unfolded. The fire in their small stove was kept low and steady. The interior was a consistent 70 degrees. Solveig kept her sourdough starter, a living thing that would have frozen solid in any other cabin, bubbling gently in a crock on a kitchen shelf. The smell of baking rye bread filled the warm, still air. Bjorn and Freya sat at the table in their shirt sleeves, whittling figures from scraps of pine, their fingers nimble and warm. The journey to the bathhouse was an act of simple domesticity, not a polar expedition. Einar would open the low, thick door in the corner of the cabin, and a breath of cool, earthy-smelling air would enter, not a blast of Arctic cold. He would walk the 40 feet of the tunnel, lit by a single lantern, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden planks. The air was chilly, but it was the manageable chill of a cellar, not the lethal cold of the outside. Inside the small bathhouse, steam from the spring kept the air moist and warm. The family bathed daily, a luxury unimaginable to their neighbors, who hadn't had a full-body wash in weeks. To prove a point to himself, Einar conducted an experiment. One evening, he took 2 wet rags. He hung one on a peg, driven into the timber frame at the exact midpoint of the tunnel. He hung the other on a nail on his cabin's exterior wall. The next morning, he went outside. The rag on the cabin wall was a board. It was frozen so solid that when he tried to bend it, it snapped in two with a sharp crack. He then went into the tunnel. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. He walked to the center peg. The rag hanging there was cold and damp, but it was still perfectly pliable. It draped over his hand, a soft, wet cloth. That was the proof. In a world frozen solid here, in this burrow of his own making, water had not yet surrendered. The vindication came on the 10th day of the inversion. Webb Calloway was forced to be out in the crushing cold, checking a line of survey stakes he'd placed before the fog settled in. It was miserable, dangerous work. The metal of his transit was so cold, it burned to the touch even through his gloves. His Gunter's chain, a heavy iron measuring tool, snagged constantly on the frozen crust of the snow. As dusk fell, painting the icy fog in shades of purple and gray, the chain caught on something near the Magnusson claim. Frustrated and shivering, Calloway knelt to free it. He saw it was snagged on the low, snow-covered mound of Einar's tunnel. He cursed the Icelander's foolishness. As he worked the link free, his bare hand brushed against a small, 2-inch pipe sticking out of the sod roof, a vent Einar had installed. He felt no draft. Curious, he pulled off his glove and pressed his palm against it. It was cold, but it wasn't the searing, instant cold of exposed metal. It was just cool. He paused. The world was utterly silent, muffled by the snow and the fog. There was no wind, no birds, no sound, but his own ragged breathing. He expected to hear nothing but that silence. It was nearly 30 below zero. Everything liquid on the continent was frozen solid. On an impulse he didn't understand, he pressed his ear against the small vent pipe, sealing it against the side of his head. And he heard it. Through 6 inches of frozen turf, through the iron of the pipe, he heard the impossible. A faint, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of liquid water. It was the sound of the drain Einar had laid at the bottom of the tunnel, carrying away the condensation, functioning perfectly in the heart of the deepest freeze he had ever known. The sound broke something in Calloway's professional certainty. It was a sound that had no right to exist in his world at that moment. He stood up, his mind reeling. He looked at the main cabin, smoke, curling weakly from its chimney, and then at the bathhouse. He walked not to the front door, but to the bathhouse. He knocked. Einar opened the door. A cloud of warm, moist steam billowed out. Behind him, Calloway could see the 2 children, wrapped in towels, their faces flushed and healthy. They were laughing. The surveyor stared, speechless. He had expected to see a family huddled on the brink of survival. He saw a family that was thriving. He looked from the warm bathhouse to the long, low mound connecting it to the cabin. He finally understood. The structure wasn't a liability. It was the entire system. He looked at Einar, the quiet man he had mocked for months. "You didn't build a ditch, Magnusson," Calloway said, his voice hoarse. "You stitched the earth together over the top of winter." When the great cold finally broke in late February, the story of the sound of dripping water spread across the bench. It was Calloway himself who told it most often, with the zeal of a convert. The proof of the pliable rag became a local legend. Survival on the frontier was a practical matter. Theories meant nothing, but results were everything. Einar's result was undeniable. He had used less than half the wood of his neighbors and had lived in greater comfort and health. He never gloated. When Silas Croft came to him, hat in hand, and asked how it was done, Einar simply walked him through the tunnel, explaining the principles of the ground warmth, the sod roof, and the drain. He drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick. He shared his knowledge freely, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The following autumn, the idea began to spread, adapted for different needs. 3 other Scandinavian homesteaders on the bench, Lars Johansson, Sven Olofsson, and Anders Nielsen, who understood the logic of earth sheltering from their own homelands, copied the design. They didn't have hot springs, but they built sod-roofed tunnels connecting their cabins to their root cellars. The result was transformative. Their potatoes and carrots no longer froze in the deepest cold. They could access their winter stores without ever facing a blizzard. Their wives praised the innovation, as it meant they didn't have to haul frozen vegetables through snowdrifts. The idea found its way into official channels as well. A young Cheyenne land office clerk named Thomas Reed, tasked with updating survey maps, visited the Magnusson claim. he was fascinated by the tunnel. With Einar's permission, he spent an afternoon measuring its dimensions and sketching a detailed cross-section in his survey notebook, complete with notes on the sod layering and the rock drain. Those notes, filed away in the territorial capital, were eventually reviewed by engineers planning government outposts in the high country. Einar's simple, ancient solution became a data point, an officially recorded piece of practical wisdom that would influence the design of structures in the harshest parts of the territory for years to come. Einar Magnusson's tunnel was more than just a clever piece of frontier engineering. It represented a fundamental shift in perspective, a piece of old-world wisdom that anticipated the most advanced principles of modern building science by over a century. Today, we call these concepts earth-sheltered construction, passive geothermal exchange, and the importance of a continuous thermal envelope. Architects and engineers use complex software to model the heat loss Einar understood in his bones. He didn't have BTUS or R values, but he knew the Earth held a gentle, constant warmth. He knew that still air was an insulator. And he knew that the most vulnerable part of any system is the gap between its components. His sod-roofed passage was, in essence, a primitive version of a passive house, a structure so well insulated and sealed that it requires minimal active heating. He had built a system that worked with the laws of physics, not in spite of them. The story of the firehole bench serves as a powerful reminder. The other settlers saw winter as an enemy to be fought with a bigger fire, a thicker wall, a more aggressive assault. Theirs was a battle of attrition they were destined to lose, or at least to never truly win. They were focused on heating their rooms. Einar Magnusson understood the deeper truth. The challenge wasn't about making a room warmer. It was about making the journey between rooms insignificant. He didn't heat two rooms against winter. He made winter irrelevant to the space between them. True innovation, his quiet work suggests, is rarely about applying more force. It is about redefining the boundaries of the problem until the force you once fought no longer applies to your world at all. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and thermal physics as fascinating as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. We believe the past has practical lessons for the future, and your support helps us share them. And we're still curious. Tell us in the comments about the cleverest piece of folk architecture you know of for dealing with extreme weather. Disclaimer: this presentation is for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, but the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices of earth-sheltered building. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and engineering practices. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.